There was once a member of my family who was urging me not to get involved in revolutionary politics. And one thing that they said to me, this was someone from the older generation, they said to me, Caleb, back in my day, there were all kinds of people protesting and being activists. If you want to be an activist, that's fine. No, back when I was a kid, I was always hearing about people marching for civil rights, people marching against the Vietnam War, people marching and being active in the streets and getting involved in politics. There was a whole group, I think they were called Students for a Democratic Society, and they were always protesting and being involved in stuff. If you want to be an activist, a lot of people do that. But Caleb, none of those people back then who were marching for civil rights or marching against the Vietnam War, none of those people back in my day, none of those activists were communists. Well, this person in my family was very, 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 very wrong. Bible book favorite. They were very wrong. All those people were communists. Communists have been essential to every progressive struggle in the last 100 years, at least, of U.S. history. Before Dr. Martin Luther King was a household name, before he had even led the Montgomery bus boycott, the Communist Party of the United States had raised the slogan of equal rights for black workers, black and white, unite and fight. They had built the Civil Rights Congress, led by a communist named W.E.B. Du Bois and another communist named William L. Patterson. They actually took a petition to the United Nations exposing the horrors of Jim Crow segregation called We Charge Genocide. And the Soviet Union gave the American communists and the black community a platform at the UN to expose the horrors of racism. The struggle for women to get the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony, they've even put on a coin because she was so pivotal in winning women the right to vote. She had a famous exchange with Eugene Debs, the leader of the Socialist Party. She said to Eugene Debs, if you give us suffrage, we will give you socialism. And Eugene Debs famously said to her, if you give us socialism, we will give you suffrage. And there was a deep understanding that the anti-capitalist revolutionary movement and the struggle to get women the right to vote were one in the same. During the Vietnam War, the first protest against the Vietnam War, the first national protest, which was talked about by Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the communists of Vietnam, and he acknowledged it. It was in the early 60s. The first national demonstration against the Vietnam War was organized by Youth Against War and Fascism, a communist organization. Long before the liberals and the hippies were marching against the Vietnam War, the Youth Against War and Fascism, the Young Communist League, and the W.E.B. Du Bois clubs, the Progressive Labor Party, they were marching against war. Why is it? We always hear about those good-paying industrial jobs, right? Those good-paying industrial jobs. They say that, our young people are stuck in low-wage, short-term service sector jobs. But what about the good-paying industrial jobs? Well, how do you think that the jobs in the steel mills and in the auto plants got to be good-paying jobs? How is it that auto workers and steel workers and textile workers and meat packers and truck drivers, how is it that they got good wages? It was because of these people called communists. Communists built the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. There was the Flint sit-down strike, the Gettysburg of the labor movement, where workers occupied their factory. And the leaders of that struggle, Homer Martin, Bill McKay, the leaders of the United Auto Workers were Communist Party members. Right? Even Walter and Victor Reuther were Socialist Party members. They went to the Soviet Union and observed a Soviet auto plant up close. They said positive things about Stalin. Right? You could talk about the steel workers, right? And how the steel workers across the country were organized into the unions. That was communists. That was communists who did it. Communists like Gus Hall, and William Z. Foster, who led the National Steel Strike of 1919, Gus Hall of Youngstown, Ohio, who organized steel workers to shoot down airplanes when they tried to fly scabs into the plant over the picket line of armed workers outside in Youngstown. You can read about the Teamsters of Minneapolis, right? The truck drivers who shut down the city in 1934. They said no scab trucks. And they had Union patrols with baseball bats walking around making sure that nobody was going to scab on the Teamsters Union. Jimmy Hoffa. People hear a lot about Jimmy Hoffa. They made a movie about him recently, a movie with Al Pacino. Well, where did Jimmy Hoffa come from? Jimmy Hoffa was not a communist. Jimmy Hoffa was a conservative. He voted for Nixon. But who taught Jimmy Hoffa how to make a tough union? Jimmy Hoffa was trained by Farrell Dobbs and James Cannon. And it was Trotskyite communists who taught Jimmy Hoffa how to fight dirty and how to build a strong union. There would be no Jimmy Hoffa if it weren't for communists. Right? Why do you think the dock workers of San Francisco have a strong labor union? Why do you think it is that the bus drivers of Boston have one of the best contracts in the country? It's because the Boston bus drivers, who are organized into the Steelworkers Union, have a communist leadership of their labor union. You can go throughout the United States. In every corner of the country, you can see the tremendously positive impact that communists have had on the country, whether it's in the steel mills, whether it's in the coal mines, whether it's on the docks, whether it's in the meatpacking plants, whether it's in the neighborhoods that benefited from once having good-paying industrial jobs, whether it's the black community that no longer lives under Jim Crow segregation and the horrors of an apartheid system in the U.S. South, whether it's women who have the right to vote and the right to reproductive choice. You can go throughout the United States and you can see the huge benefits of communists. It was communists who won these things. This is a fact. It was not liberals. It was not progressives. It was communists. C-O-M-M-U-N-I-S-T, communists, who won so much of what the American working class has. People think that communists just focus on overseas struggles. They're not concerned about events in the United States. They're too busy supporting countries in a foreign land that have adopted the system that they think is ideal. That's a lie. The communists have embedded themselves in progressive and revolutionary struggles. Who do you think the Black Panthers were? Were the Black Panthers liberals? No. Were the Black Panthers anarchists? No. The Black Panthers were Marxist-Leninists. The Black Panthers studied the writings of Mao Zedong and Ho Chi Minh. They had a special relationship with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. They sent delegations to Cuba. They taught classes on Marxist-Leninist ideology. They had a relationship with Gaddafi in Libya. The Black Panthers were a tanky, hardline communist organization. You betcha they were. They were not liberals by any means. They were not anarchist radlibs. No, the Black Panthers were a tanky organization. And the contribution of the Black Panther Party to the struggle of the African American community is something that cannot be ignored. It's something that is so widely understood. What isn't widely understood is that they did it because they had an understanding of the revolutionary science of Marxism-Leninism. They were anti-imperialists to their core. Read the writings of Huey Newton and how deeply he understood revolutionary theories, how he rejected identity politics, but instead developed his very unique theory called intercommunalism, arguing that the communities of the United States, the various nationalities, needed to organize in their own communities first. First the Black Panthers, then the Young Lords, then the Brown Berets, right? And then eventually, the white workers in the Young Patriots organization, the Gay Liberation Front, eventually they would all merge into one revolutionary united front organization that would bring down capitalism. That was the theory of the Black Panthers, who developed their survival pending revolution program. The Black Panthers were Marxist-Leninists and tankies to their core. Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, these were people that definitely understood Marxism and definitely rejected liberal reformist notions. You bet they did. In the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln had a general, and that general in his army, a brigadier general, was named August Willich. And August Willich was a member of the International Working Men's Association. He was a communist. Joseph Wedemeyer led an entire division of U.S. soldiers that fought against the slaveholders in Missouri, but they were the Ohio 9th Regiment. Joseph Wedemeyer and the Ohio 9th Regiment were a communist division of the Union Army. They were mainly German immigrants, and they sang the French Revolutionary anthem La Marseillaise as they marched into battle, and they used a red flag as their official emblem. So don't you doubt for a minute that communists have deep roots in this country in terms of progressive organizing and struggle. Communists led the struggle against slavery. Communists led the struggle for civil rights. Communists built the organized labor movement. Communists fought for the right of women to vote. Communists, tankies, hardliners, Marxist-Leninists, anti-imperialists. These are the people that built the progressive and left-wing movement in the United States. It has always been the hardliners, the revolutionaries, the tankies, the anti-imperialists, the folks who understood to their core that capitalism and imperialism must be abolished and that a whole new society must be created where the banks, factories, and industries and major centers of power are controlled by the people, that the means of production must be centralized into the hands of the working class, into a centrally planned economy to raise people up from poverty. It has always been those with that understanding who have led the progressive movement in the United States. But who have they fought against? Well, primarily they've fought against who? They've primarily fought against the bosses, right? The bankers, the billionaires, the war makers, the ruling class, the owners of the means of production, those who control the commanding heights of economic power. Marxism talks about two classes: the working class that have nothing to sell but their labor power and live only so long as their work enriches capital, and the owning class, the capitalists, those who own the oil wells and the big box stores and the factories and the mines and the airlines and the means of transportation and the means of communication. The owning class, the billionaire banker monopolists that seek to dominate the world and drive entire nations into poverty so they can continue to enrich themselves and drive and grind American people into poverty. Right? That is who the working class and the revolutionary movement has struggled against. But there has always been another enemy, and that is the reformist, sellout, manipulative cancer within our own movement. Right? There have been those who preach socialism but practice fascism to preserve capitalism for the bosses. Those who talk like they are revolutionaries, but behind the doors are scheming with the imperialists. Those who always try to convince, with left-wing sounding language, try to convince the revolutionary movement to support the latest imperialist war of plunder that the bosses are waging. Those who try to divert the working class away from the struggle to build a whole new society, but instead push the working class and the revolutionary movement into the dead end of reformism. This has always been a cancer. Those who seek to push the working class off the revolutionary road and into the dead end of reformism and operating as the passive foot soldiers of the bosses. This has always been a problem in the revolutionary movement. And this is something that progressive people have always had to deal with. If you are someone who believes in socialism, if you are somebody who wants a whole new society, how do you deal with the labor fakers? How do you deal with the union hacks and the corrupt bureaucracy? How do you deal with the sellout liberals? How do you deal with this element that seeks to crush the revolutionary movement while saying one thing and doing another. How do you deal with them? How do you deal with them? That is a question. In some cases, it's necessary to form an alliance with them. Right? During the 1930s, by entering an alliance with the Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party, the Communist Party USA and the labor movement was able to make great strides, and eventually the United States and the Soviet Union were able to join arm in arm to defeat the Nazis. However, in other instances, it is absolutely necessary to call them out, to expose them, to enter into a two-line struggle where you call out the reformist elements, you expose them, and you lay out the revolutionary message. Different situations call for different tactics. In some instances, it is necessary to form a class collaborationist united front. In other instances, it is necessary to try and form a working class united front. In other instances, it is necessary to engage in ideological battle with political tendencies in the working class movement that are engaging in opportunism. Different tactics are employed in different circumstances, but the goal remains the same. How can we get out of the disaster of capitalism? How can we get to a society where profits are no longer in command, but the needs of the people come first? How can we get to a society where the people have what they need and no more is the economy organized simply to serve a group of billionaires and bankers? How can we get to a society where the people rule and the profiteers no longer are in command of society? How can we get rid of the system of imperialism where a small group of global corporations and bankers dominate the world and beat down so many countries? How can we get beyond that? What tactics should be employed for the purpose of maneuvering to overturn the capitalist system and get to a whole new society? What tactic should be employed in the revolutionary movement? That is the question that has faced so many revolutionaries and progressives and organizers. That has been the question. And I have long maintained that the only way that socialism has a chance amid this crisis that we are in is to change its tactics. Look, folks, during the Cold War in the United States, you had a very big aristocracy of labor. The term aristocracy of labor does not refer to union bosses. That is a misconception. Often if you say labor aristocracy, people think of union bosses. That's not what the term means. Lenin wrote a very important book called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And in that book, he referred to the fact that as the billionaire monopolist corporations, as the big bankers are carving out spheres of influence over the world, as they're going to Africa and beating people down and grinding the people there into poverty, as they're going to Asia and destroying people and committing crimes and murdering people and driving people into poverty, as they're seeking to dominate the world with their cartels and monopolies and big corporations, they are able to buy off a section of the working class at home. They're able to give a few crumbs to sections of the working class. And with those few crumbs they give to the sections of the working class at home, they're able to purchase their loyalty. The aristocracy of labor started out in the United States with the division between the skilled workers and the unskilled workers. The American Federation of Labor, the AFL, the first major labor union federation in the United States, banned unskilled workers. It only hired what it called skilled workers, or craftsmen, plumbers, pipe fitters, masons, bricklayers, right? If you worked on an assembly line, you were not welcome in the AFL. Furthermore, the AFL was a white union. It was racist. It was only for white people. right? It was a white workers' union. They refused to allow black people to work in AFL unions, and as a result of that, black people were kept out of many jobs and many skilled trades and construction, right? And it was this current, by the bosses giving more treatment, giving special treatment, giving higher wages to skilled workers in the crafts and the trades. It was because of that. It was because of that these sections of the working class became more conservative. They began to identify more with their bosses than with other workers. They began to support imperialist wars around the world. They began to think that, hey, if the American capitalists and imperialists can rise, we will rise right along with them. And that was the beginning of what they called the aristocracy of labor. And communists fought against it. Communists organized the textile workers. They organized the workers in the South, the sharecroppers. They organized the steel workers and the lower paid workers against, struggling against this tendency by the aristocracy of labor, the higher paid workers, to be more conservative and to not care about the other workers and to support imperialism. Lenin said that because of this problem of aristocracy of labor, of the working class being stratified, because of that, it was necessary for communists to go lower and deeper to the masses, to get among the working class who get left behind by the labor movement, who get left behind by the corrupt union bosses, to get to the impoverished working masses and organize them. And they did it. And communists organized, eventually built the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And they organized those workers in the steel mill, a lot of whom were from Eastern Europe or from Ireland or from Italy. Maybe a lot of them didn't speak English. They were recent immigrants, and they were in the urban centers being worked to death in these sweatshops. And communists said, we're going to organize them, and we're going to build a union for them. They built the CIO. First it was the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. Then the Trade Union Unity League, the TUUL, was the Communist Party-led labor federation. And then there was a very glorious moment in American history. You'll have to remember it was a very glorious moment. The American Federation of Labor, the AFL, was having a convention. And it was John L. Lewis, the leader of the Miners Union, who got up at the AFL convention. And he called out the right-wing labor bureaucrats, and he said he wanted to organize the factory workers. He believed in industrial organization. And then he punched one of these AFL guys in the face. He punched him in the face and led the miners' union and the Teamsters to march out of the American Federation of Labor. And with the help of the Communist Party, they had no shame. They had no shame in working with the Communist Party. They set up the CIO, right? That was a definitive moment, right? And a few months after the CIO was formed, in Akron, Ohio, rubber workers went on strike. But this time they didn't just go on strike because they had a fear that the plant would be closed down and they would lose their jobs. So the rubber workers went to their factory and they occupied it. They sat down. And in Akron, Ohio, 1935, you had the 1936, you had the sit-down strike in Akron, Ohio. And the CIO, communist-led rubber workers in Akron, Ohio, were victorious because when they went on strike, not only did they have a picket line outside the plant, but they essentially held the plant hostage. They said, we work here. This plant is our livelihoods. We are going to not just let it go. We're going to occupy our factory until you give in to our demands and recognize our union. That was the sit-down strike in Akron, Ohio. And a few months later, in Flint, Michigan, workers at a General Motors plant heard that they might be losing, so they occupied their factories. And John L. Lewis, the leader of the Miners Union, he went and mobilized thousands of people to go to Flint to support the auto workers who were occupying their plant. The police tried to clear the workers out of the auto plant, right, in Flint. And there was an incident they called the famous Battle of Bull's Run, where the workers in the auto plant turned on the fire hoses of the auto plant and mowed down the police with the fire hoses, knocked over the police. Back then, the slang term for a police officer, they called police officers bulls, and they called it the Battle of Bull's Run. because the labor organizers were making all the police officers run by spraying them with fire hoses and throwing wrenches and screws at them, and it was a battle to keep control of their plant. And then the Black Legion, a fascist organization, a Ku Klux Klan-like organization, a group of sympathizers with Adolf Hitler and Father Coughlin, they assembled. The police had been beaten back, so the fascists mobilized to attack the striking workers in the plant. And what did the communists do? They fought off the fascists, and they drove the Black Legion and the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazi sympathizers, some of whom claimed that they were the real socialists, but yet they were willing to scab and try and violently attack striking workers. They were strike breakers, drove them away. And then John L. Lewis, the leader of the miners' union, the mine workers' union, he famously got in front of the factory in Flint, Michigan, and he said, if they send the army into this factory and they start shooting the workers, they're going to have to shoot me. And he ripped his shirt open and bared his strong chest, a miner, and said, you're going to have to shoot me. You're going to have to go through me, the leader of the miners' union, if you want to drive these workers out of the plant. And then the U.S. Army showed up at the plant in Flint, Michigan. The U.S. military marched in. And everyone was very, very nervous as the U.S. military marched into Flint, Michigan. He didn't know what was going to happen. The U.S. Army marched in with machine guns and tanks and bayonets. And people thought this is going to be a massacre. This is going to be it. It's all going to be over. But then something happened that changed the course of U.S. history forever. The machine gun of the U.S. Army was set up in front of the factory, and it pointed away from the factory because Franklin Delano Roosevelt had sent the U.S. Army not to drive the strikers out of the plant, but to protect the striking workers, from the police, from the Ku Klux Klan, from the fascists. Roosevelt sent the military to protect striking workers in Flint, Michigan. And that was a defining moment in American history. The President of the United States not only supported the right of workers to go on strike, but actually sent the military to defend their right to occupy their factory. That was a defining moment. And why did Roosevelt do that? Why did Roosevelt make that decision? Well, it was because of the fact that Roosevelt was under attack. The Nazis and the fascists wanted to remove him from office. Roosevelt was presiding over the U.S. economy. Things were getting worse in the U.S. economy, and Roosevelt knew that the only way he could prevent a fascist takeover of America was if he entered a strategic alliance with the labor unions, with the socialists, and with the communists. And it was because of that strategy of building a united front at the right moment, but holding Roosevelt accountable and forcing Roosevelt into an alliance. It was because of that great victory was won. And after Roosevelt made clear that he supported workers' rights to join unions, after Roosevelt made clear that he supported the right of workers to occupy their factories, the sit-down strike wave exploded across the United States. In every corner of the country, workers were sitting down and occupying their plants, and the bosses didn't know what to do. They had never seen anything like it, and the President of the United States was supporting their right to do it, and it was an epic moment in American history, and it's because of that the good-paying jobs existed in the steel mills and in the auto plants and in the textile mills and in the meatpacking facilities. If it hadn't been for that epic moment in American history where the Communist Party mobilized, where they stood up to the labor fakers, they entered a strategic alliance with Roosevelt, they built a popular front against fascism, they maneuvered through all of this, trying different tactics strategically. It's because of that we had those good-paying jobs in the steel mills and in the plants. But what happened after World War II? After World War II, there was McCarthyism. The communists were kicked out of the labor unions. And a lot of American workers after World War II, they had those very, very comfortable, good-paying jobs. They had the benefits that communists had won for them on the class battlefield. And they became supporters of imperialism, right? And we know about this. That white picket fence, that house, and that car, that made a lot of white American workers very sympathetic to U.S. imperialism. Made a lot of American workers very chauvinistic. Made a lot of American workers very racist, right? That even though they had to fight their way in to decent wages, when the industrial workers of the United States were absorbed into the labor aristocracy, it had a conservatizing effect on them. And that's why after World War II, they were able to go after the Communist Party and jail the Communist Party, have the FBI infiltrate the Communist Party, isolate the Communist Party after World War II. And the U.S. economy, because the USA was not the only was the only industrial country in the world that wasn't really blown up during the Second World War, the USA was at the center of the global economy. It had a booming economy. And because of that, the American working class became very, very, very conservative. Right? There was still a civil rights movement among the black workers. There were still progressives and socialists who supported it. And when the Vietnam War started and they wanted to draft young men to go fight in Vietnam, a lot of young men said, I really don't want to go die to stop Ho Chi Minh, and there was an anti-war movement. But that was only isolated. That was on the college campuses. That was among the African-American community. But in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, even up into the 80s and 90s, the broad masses of the American people were conservative. There was a hit song at one point called Okie from Muskogee by Merrill Haggard. People ever heard that song? It's a country song. And it was about an average small town where no one protests anything. You know, we don't smoke marijuana in Muskogee. You know, I mean, it's all about average working class Americans hate hippies and protesters. Football's the roughest thing on campus, and the kids here still respect the college dean. We still wave Old Glory down at the courthouse, right? And you saw this, right? And this was how neoconservatism was able to take hold. Neoconservatism was an adjustment of the American right wing and conservatives. And suddenly conservatives were saying that we're for the average American. The average American worker doesn't like protesting. The average American doesn't like people that are leftists. No, the average American is sick of these elitist college kids and these ethnic minorities, and he doesn't care. The average American loves war and militarism and loves police brutality. And that was the attitude. Average Americans didn't want to hear it. And communists were forced to adjust their tactics. You read about the early years of Students for a Democratic Society and SDS. They tried to organize unemployment councils in suburban neighborhoods. People didn't want to hear it. They tried to go door to door and organize poverty campaigns. Didn't really work. Students for a Democratic Society in the 1960s, this big leftist organization, realized that 1930s-style populist class struggle politics wasn't going to work. That the best way to organize was on the college campuses. The best way to organize was to organize against the draft. The Black Panthers had great success in the black community, where there was a lot of poverty, a lot of anger at racism. And, the communist groups recruited heavily among anti-war protesting college kids, among intellectuals who traveled around the world and understood what American imperialism was really about. But the broad masses of Americans didn't want to hear it. The broad masses of Americans had no interest in this kind of politics. They said, my country, right or wrong, America's the greatest country in the world. If you don't like it here, you should move to another country. Communism is unpatriotic and un-American. Average Americans didn't want to hear it. Average Americans said, communism's not Christian. Communism's dictatorship. We believe in democracy. We're free. Communist countries are not free. Average Americans didn't want to hear it. And that's not to say that folks in that 1960s era didn't try. There was a whole grouping called the New Communist Movement of the 1970s. And they were people who'd protested the Vietnam War, protested for civil rights. They joined various attempts to build a new communist party in the United States. They formed many different groups. There was the Revolutionary Union, which eventually became the Revolutionary Communist Party. There was the Progressive Labor Party. There was the Communist Workers' Party. There was the Democratic Workers' Party. There was the Communist Labor Party. There were many different groups. There was the Communist Party, Marxist-Leninist, or the October League. There were many, many different radicals of this period who knew that you can't make a revolution without the broad masses of people, that the college kids on the campuses, the black community isolated and facing racism, they were not going to be able to make, Smedley Butler, a revolution by themselves. And it was mainly this new communist movement, these Maoists, right? Marxist-Leninists, people inspired by China, who said we have to get to the masses, we have to build a new communist party. And they spent 10 years trying to build a new communist party among American workers. They got jobs in factories. They sold communist newspapers to their fellow factory workers. They tried to work inside of the unions. Didn't work. But then in 1978, the U.S. economy crashed. There was a big economic downturn. And it was in that moment that this new communist movement was very excited. They said, finally, now we've got our chance. Now we'll be able to win over the American workers. But what happened in 1978? 1978, big economic downturn. But you have to remember that's the time of the Iranian Revolution. That's, the hostage crisis happened, and, Americans were taken hostage in Iran, and they were able to mobilize this right-wing hysteria, that, patriotism, and the economy was getting worse. And while the economy was getting worse, all these American industrial workers who were seeing their wages and their jobs go down very significantly for the first major time since the Second World War, they said, look, clearly we need to go be more conservative. And Ronald Reagan promised he was going to bring back the 1950s. And so at that point, you had the rise of Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan rallied American industrial workers to become more racist, more pro-war, more chauvinist. He had these hate rallies against Iran that he would mobilize, and it was in the 1980s and the early 80s, in response to this economic downturn, the American working class became more conservative in the face of the first economic downturn. And the communists became desperate. They became very desperate. And they did very desperate things. The Communist Workers' Party challenged the Ku Klux Klan to a shootout. And what resulted was called the Greensboro Massacre, a horrendous event where the KKK showed up at their rally and shot 5 of them. The Revolutionary Communist Party would have these adventurist campaigns. They had May Day 1980, they called it. May Day 1980. Big rallies that they would have and get beaten up by right-wingers and adventurism. And it was in around 1980 that you had the Great Retreat, where many of these very, very dedicated radicals, Marxist-Leninists, communists from this time period, who had spent so many years in the factories, so many years doing what you're supposed to do and get to the broad masses of people, said it'll never work, and they walked away, and they retreated. And some of them retreated to the college campuses, to academia. Some of them retreated to the labor bureaucracy. Some of them retreated to forming NGOs and getting involved in the Democratic Party. They all went somewhere other than to the masses. They decided that average Americans would never be recruitable to Marxism and socialism. Average Americans could never possibly be won over. So we just have to retreat from the broad masses of people, because at this point, average Americans are just too brainwashed, too right-wing. So we'll organize the college kids, we'll organize the black community, we'll maneuver inside the labor unions, but there's no hope for getting to the average masses of people. That was a long time ago. That was before I was born. I was born in 1987. And this was before I was born this happened. This is in the early 80s this happened. The Great Retreat. A lot has happened since 1981. Between 1981 and 2020, the labor aristocracy, that comfortable layer of U.S. society of well-paid industrial workers who sympathized with their bosses and had pro-imperialist views, the Okie from Muskogee crowd, they have lost their jobs. They have lost their homes. Their kids are addicted to opioids. Their grandkids are committing suicide. Their neighborhoods have roads that are not paved. They are not drinking water that is properly purified. Their living standards have gone down. It has gotten worse amid this pandemic. Unemployment is everywhere. People are struggling. Most adults with children are still supporting their children. Even into their 30s and 40s, they're still supporting them. People can't live on their own. A whole generation has been robbed. Decent wages and a decent job. Low-wage, short-term service sector jobs are the life that so many young Americans have been forced to live. It is a disaster. It is a disaster what so many people, working-class people in the United States, are living with. And the reality is they continue to take polls that show that socialism and communism are very popular in the United States right now. 1 in 3 Americans says that they believe in socialism. It's actually a decent percentage that say they believe in communism. The polls show that average Americans are ready to hear it. Average working-class Americans voted for Bernie Sanders by the millions. Average Americans are ready to hear it. And furthermore, average Americans are against the wars. Poll after poll after poll shows that average Americans are tired of the wars. They are sick of the wars. But the communist groups are all still led by people who've decided that this is not possible. They've decided it's not possible to get to average Americans. The average Americans will never be won over. We've just got to focus on identity politics. We got to focus on doing this intellectual thing on the campuses. Oh, no. Average Americans can never be won over. They've decided. Even though average Americans are capable of being won over, average Americans are already won over largely. They just haven't been organized. The communist movement in the United States has focused on maneuvering among certain sectors of U.S. society and ignored the big enchilada. They have ignored the broad masses of Americans who are ready to resist capitalism, ready to fight back, ready to start moving towards socialism. And of course, the same crowd of fakers, social democrats, that same crowd of fakers has now decided that you're not allowed to try and win over average Americans. That populism is fascism. You're a Nazbol. And even though the average Americans are largely opposed to the wars, certain elements have been dispatched in the socialist movement to try and convince socialists to support these wars, right? The Jacobin crowd, they have conferences where they invite not socialists from around the world, but anti-socialists. People trying to overthrow Maduro get to speak at Jacobin, well-funded Jacobin conferences paid for by the Jewish Communal Fund, a pro-Israeli lobby group, right? People trying to overthrow the Chinese government are platformed at these big conferences paid for by the Jewish Communal Fund and the Jacobin organization. Israeli lobby groups sponsoring pro-imperialist socialist entities have been mobilized to try and use young Americans who are interested in socialism as foot soldiers in their latest color revolution. Meanwhile, if you actually demand that U.S. leaders actually improve the lives of Americans, like Jimmy Dore has, demanding that AOC actually fight for health care, they get demonized, right? Well, folks, as much as I spend a lot of time arguing with AOC and Jacobin and Trotskyites and social democrats and Skippy the Bear and Jabba the Vosh and people like that, as much as I do that, in the end, that is really not going to accomplish very much. It's good entertainment. That's why I do it. You all love to watch the show. And it's good that their arguments get answered. But the only way these social democrats are going to be defeated is by getting to the broad masses of people. We have to get to average Americans. The only way we're going to move towards socialism in the United States is if average Americans living in Ohio and Kansas and Kentucky and Tennessee and Wisconsin and South Carolina and Alabama and California and Oregon, if average Americans become convinced that socialism is the answer, you're not going to win with the college campuses. You're not going to win with identity politics. The broad masses of Americans must understand that socialism is their future and that socialism is not a progressive income tax. Socialism is not the post office. Socialism isn't starting a worker co-op with your friends where we share our pencils. Socialism is a government of action that fights for working families. It is time to get out of the movement and get to the masses. The broad masses of Americans must come to understand that they have been sold down the river by the billionaires and the bankers and the monopolists, and that the only way forward is for the American people to move against capitalism and become anti-imperialists. The same big corporations that profit from locking people in prison, profit from the opioid epidemic, profit from destroying homes and communities in America, in Ohio and Kansas and Michigan, Milwaukee. The same big corporations that dominate the world economy and destroy the lives of American workers are destroying the lives of workers in Syria. They funded terrorists to try and unleash chaos and overthrow a Ba'athist Arab socialist government in Syria. The same forces, the same groups, the same big corporations that are destroying the lives of Americans are trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela. They're trying to start a trade war with China. They're trying to preach the nonsensical illogic that somehow Russia rigs U.S. elections, Russiagate. Of course, the hacks at Jacobin are trying to confuse American workers about this. Of course, the Trotskyite scum, who've always been on the wrong side of every revolutionary movement, are trying to confuse workers about this. The only way to get out of this is to get to the broad masses. We need to build a socialist movement that gets to average Americans. As working class Americans are suffering and angry, we have to get to them. We have to get out of the protest cage and get to the masses. That's the only way out of this. It's the only way out of this. Average Americans need to understand that what we need is a government of action that will fight for working families. That's what we need to do. We have to get to the masses. We must get to the masses of people. That is the only answer. It's the only answer. The only way we can do it is we have to get to the broad masses of the American people. If we don't do that, if we do not get to the masses, there is no hope. If there's any hope, it lies with the broad masses of people. The only way to outdo the socialist fakers is to get to the broad masses of people. And that means changing our message. That means doing things that will win us the disapproval of lots of left book losers on Twitter. Right? That means framing our message in a way that doesn't necessarily appeal to these people. It's getting beyond these people and getting to the broad masses. That is what is needed right now. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. That's what we need. That is what is desperately needed right now. And that is basically what all the fake left and all the phonies and all the identity politics and all of the liberal professor programs and all of the NGOs and everything has been set up to prevent us from doing. We have to get to average Americans who are suffering right now with a revolutionary, populist, anti-imperialist message that gets them to understand the same people that are trying to destroy Iran are the same people that are destroying their communities. The American working class has a common enemy with the working people of the world. And the only way things will change is if the system of global monopoly capitalism, the Atlanticist pathology, the British Empire economic global setup, the Adam Smith global trade system is dismantled, and a new order based on win-win cooperation comes into being. That's what needs to happen. That is what needs to happen. We understand this. Our community that watches these lives, we understand this. And we've published books about this. We're building the Center for Political Innovation. Every day I get new emails from people that want to be involved, and I plug them right in. We are ready to move ahead. The pandemic is certainly getting in our way. We're moving ahead, folks. We've got our work cut out for us. Only we have the message. Only we have the understanding of what imperialism actually is, about what socialism actually is. We can do it. We can absolutely do it. But sometimes it requires a choice. Sometimes you have to make a decision. Sometimes the role of the individual can be decisive. So you need to ask yourself, how committed are you to this? How much are you willing to do to save the socialist movement and save America from capitalism? Ask yourself this. This is something we all have to ask ourselves with. Because, folks, one thing that I must tell you, and I tell you this with all sincerity, is there is nothing more satisfying than being a communist. It is a great life. To be able to wake up every day and know that you are on the right side of history, that you have given every effort to dismantle the system of capitalism. You have given every effort to expose the lies of empire and to build a new world. That is the most satisfying feeling. It is an absolutely satisfying feeling to know that there are millions of people just like you in China, in Vietnam, in Cuba, in Venezuela, millions of people like you in capitalist countries, Britain, France, Germany, India, that you are part of a global effort to dismantle a heartless and ruthless system and build a new world based on science and reason. It is a deeply, deeply empowering feeling. And it's not enough to just be a keyboard cruncher. Right? When you're sitting there on your computer alone, you can feel isolated, and you can see leftists screaming at each other on internet forums, and it can all just be very, very depressing. Folks, what we need to come out of this pandemic, we need socialists, especially now with the low-income economy and the unemployment. We need socialists to start living with each other. Communities, socialist houses. Young people move in together, have a socialist house where people rent rooms, they live together, and they study Marxism together, and they build a socialist organization together. We need there to be socialist food drives that go on, where socialists are feeding hungry people. We need there to be socialists in every community doing clothing drives for low-income people and single mothers. We need there to be socialists providing services, and we need there to be a socialist community, not a socialist online community, but a socialist IRL, in real life community, feeding people, caring for people, teaching people ideology. That is what is needed. That is what is needed. More than anything, that is what is needed. We need to build a socialist community among the masses. A socialist community that people don't have to go looking for. I went looking for the communists. You know that? When I got interested in communism, I Googled communist groups. I went looking for them. I had to go find the communist groups. I had to track them down. It shouldn't be like that. It should be in every neighborhood, every community. There's a local communist office that has free food giveaways and Friday night programs with speeches and songs and music. There's a house full of young people who live together and, and hold some things in common and study Marxism together and go around promoting revolutionary ideology together and spending their free time not smoking a bong and not watching porno, but instead spend their free time going out and organizing and feeding hungry people and going out and spreading the revolutionary message and winning people over to socialist ideology. We need to build a socialist community. There needs to be a socialist community that exists all across the United States. That needs to exist. Right? That is what needs to exist. There needs to be a socialist community. There needs to be an apparatus of people who are dedicated to building socialism, dedicated to working for it, and dedicated to building an apparatus, a political infrastructure to bring it about. Right? We need people to be fanatical. Right? This is one of the things that's always annoyed me about U.S. society. One cliche we always hear in the United States is, oh, we don't need fanatics. We don't need, never be fanatical. Moderation in all things. Right? Right? We want people that are not fanatical. We can't have fanatics. Folks, if you had a heart attack, they came in an ambulance, and they picked you up. They were taking you in your ambulance to a hospital. I have a feeling that if your life was on the line, you would want to be treated by a fanatical doctor. You wouldn't say, oh no, take me to a doctor who got average grades in medical school. Make sure the doctor is high on marijuana while he's operating on my heart. Oh, no, 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 no. If your life was on the line, you would want the most fanatical, the most dedicated doctor to work on you. The one who had given the whole of their life to understanding the medical profession. You would want that person to start operating on you. Very drastic circumstances require fanatics. In normal times, sure, you want politicians that are normal. These are not normal times. The planet has a heart attack right now. The planet is having a heart attack. The entire society we're in is crumbling. Now more than ever, we need a political fanatic to start operating on the country. I've often made the analogy. Revolutionaries are a lot like dentists. You ever hear that before? There's a certain group of people that really love dentistry. You know, there's that old, there's that old show, the Christmas special, claymation or something, and the kid is like playing with the doll's teeth because he wants to be a dentist, right? There's some people that are like that. Some people that love dentistry. They grow up, they want to be dentists. They are fascinated by teeth. Most people don't like going to the dentist. I certainly don't. Most people don't like dentistry. We want to stay pretty far away from the dentist unless there's an emergency. But then, you get that cavity that hurts so bad. You have no choice, but you have to go to the dentist. That's how revolutionaries are. Most people aren't cut out to be communists. They're not. Most people aren't cut out to be revolutionaries. Most people are not ready to understand dialectical materialism and Marxism-Leninism. They're not. Most people just want to live their lives and feed their kids and be happy. But they get into that situation where society is coming apart, where society cannot function, where there is an inability to live in the old way, where the society is coming apart. And when they cannot live in the old way, when a crisis is unfolding, in that moment, just like when you're in the moment where you have that cavity you can't let go, in that moment, the broad masses of people say, God damn it, I want to go find a revolutionary. Get out of my way, Democrats. Get out of my way, Republicans. Get out of my way, hippies. Get out of my way, armchair intellectuals. I want to go find a strong man. I want to go find somebody who looks like they're powerful enough to get things done. No, 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 they're not looking for pacifists. They're not looking for worker cooperatives in the woods. They're not looking for people that are triggered by authoritarianism. Oh, no, when there's a crisis, when people's lives are on the line, when people are hungry, when people are starving, when society is coming apart, they want something strong. They want something powerful. They want a force that is strong enough that it will resolve the crisis. That is what people want. And there's only two kinds of political people who can offer that: communists and fascists. And if we on the left, if we socialists can't get our act together and offer it, we know who will. There's only one way to be truly fanatical about politics, and that is to become either a socialist or a fascist. And if socialists cannot be the source of power and strength that will resolve this crisis, you know who it's going to be. There are two ways forward. One way is social progress. One way is social progress. One way is building up and applying science to the economy. That's one way to resolve the crisis. The other way to resolve the crisis is with mass destruction. Mass destruction and death. Right? World War III, that would resolve the capitalist crisis, right? If half of humanity died in the Third World War, that would resolve half the crisis. Mass genocide, right? We just exterminated half the population. That would resolve the crisis. Do we want that? No. The only way out is up. If socialism does not resolve the crisis, the only way available will be mass destruction and death and fascism. The capitalists' only hope for saving their system is fascism and war. If you want to stick with capitalism, get ready for fascism and war. But if you want a way out, socialism, workers' power, a government of action to fight for working families. Those are the two choices before us. I am trying my hardest to build the revolutionary community, to save socialism. That's the only hope we have.